In the middle of a billionaire's gala, CEO Celeste Whitlock pulled Rowan Hale from the serving line and ordered the single father to pick up a brush, to prove he was nothing but a man who talked. Laughter swept the room as Rowan held a brush for the first time in 12 years. But when the final stroke landed, Augustus Pembroke rose from his chair and called out the name of an artist the world believed had vanished. One guest bid $500,000. Another pushed it to $1 million. When the price hit $2 million, Celeste stopped laughing because the painting had just exposed a secret hidden inside her own collection. If you believe real talent cannot be buried forever, stay with Rowan as he fights to reclaim everything that was taken from him. The Whitlock Grand Hotel occupied a full city block in Midtown Manhattan, and on the night of its annual arts gala, it wore the occasion like a second skin. Every corridor lit with the particular glow that money uses to remind itself of its own importance. Every surface arranged to suggest that the wealth assembled inside was not contingent but permanent. More than 500 guests moved through the ballroom. Billionaires with assistants who moved 3 steps behind them. Museum directors exchanging careful words with gallery owners who had spent entire careers learning when to speak and when to perform listening. Journalists orbiting at the edges in search of the one moment that would justify the assignment. The evening had been announced as a celebration of rare American painting, but anyone who had attended enough of these events knew that celebration was the costume and transaction was the body beneath it. And the transaction tonight involved a partnership between Whitlock International and the Pembroke Museum Network, whose value ran well into 9 figures. Celeste Whitlock moved through her guests the way water moves through a space it has always occupied, without visible effort, without the quality of arrival, as though the room had always been arranged around her. The canvases bearing the name Vale occupied 3 display positions in the northern wing, lit with the dedicated precision of objects whose value required that every flaw be invisible, and Landon Frost, the foundation's art director, stood before them with the bearing of a man who had spent decades deciding which stories the art world deserved to believe. He described each painting in language designed to make wealthy people feel. They were purchasing not just beauty but belonging, and no one in the room had reason to question him, because no one in the room had access to information that would allow them to. Rowan Hale carried his tray through the VIP section with the careful economy of movement that a decade in service work produces, steps planned several seconds ahead, body angled to avoid contact, attention distributed across multiple tables while appearing focused on none of them. He was 43 years old, a man whose stillness read as indifference to people who did not know that stillness can sometimes be the only thing holding a person together, and he had worked the evening shift at the Whitlock Grand for 3 years, because the hours suited a parent raising a child alone. He had spent those 3 years navigating a hotel whose walls carried art he had trained himself not to look at, the same way a person trains themselves not to press a bruise, keeping his path through the room tight and his attention forward, and he would have completed the evening without incident if the painting under the title "Winter Without Footprints" had not pulled him to a stop. He looked at it for several seconds before he understood what was wrong. The light moved in the wrong direction, cascading downward from the upper registers, where no painter who had internalized this method would have placed it. The cobalt in the lower third was a commercial formula that had only reached the professional market within recent years, well after Vale was supposed to have worked. The horizon line was smooth and uninterrupted, where it should have carried 3 small deliberate fractures. and in the lower left corner, rendered in the brushwork of someone working from a reference rather than from memory, was a fragment of landscape Rowan recognized as a study he had made on a Tuesday morning 14 years ago in his Brooklyn studio, a sketch he had never finished, never photographed, and never shown to another person. A collector nearby heard the words Rowan said under his breath, that the work was not genuine, and within 2 minutes Holden Pike, the floor manager, had taken hold of Rowan's elbow and steered him toward Celeste with the eager efficiency of someone hoping his loyalty would be recorded. Celeste asked what standing a waiter had to question a team of certified experts, and her tone made it clear the question was rhetorical, and Rowan began to withdraw and excuse himself, and might have left it there if Landon Frost had not stepped forward and said, in a tone calibrated for surrounding ears, that anyone could criticize a painting as long as they were not required to produce one themselves. Celeste recognized the opportunity the moment Landon handed it to her. She directed staff to bring the easel from the preparation room, announced to the assembled room that Rowan would have 30 minutes to demonstrate whether his opinions rested on anything beyond confidence, and made clear that failure would require a public apology and an immediate departure from the premises. Rowan told her quietly that he had not held a brush in 12 years. She said the audience would then see precisely the difference between someone with genuine ability and someone who wanted to be noticed. And the laughter that followed was not hostile but relaxed, the sound of a room that had already decided the outcome and was waiting for the confirmation. Rowan looked once at the false painting bearing Vale's name, thought of Laurel, and walked to the stage. At the easel, he did not reach for the prepared white canvas. He turned it over and began to work on the raw reverse side, and that single choice caused Augustus Pembroke, seated near the center of the room, to set down his glass and sit forward, because it was exactly how Vale had always begun. Rowan did not paint the kind of image that would flatter the room. He chose not to produce a landscape the gathered wealth would recognize immediately as beautiful, not a scene with the comfortable legibility of art already validated by institutional collection. What took shape on the raw canvas was the ballroom itself, rendered from a vantage point that belonged to none of the guests present, a perspective from just outside a half-open service door, where the gap offered a narrow diagonal view of the full length of the room. Tables laden with courses no one had tracked from kitchen to plate. Chairs occupied by people looking in every direction except toward the hands that had placed the food in front of them. At the far edge of the composition, turned as though its occupant had just risen, a single empty chair. At the bottom of the frame, just inside the service door where the warmth barely reached, a pair of hands, marked with color, carrying something, positioned precisely where the chandelier's light failed to follow. In the upper register of the canvas, where tall windows opened onto the city, Rowan cut the horizon line 3 times in small, deliberate breaks that anyone familiar with the authenticated works would have recognized instantly, and that everyone else would read as texture, as the kind of imperfection that signals mastery rather than error. Near the center of the composition, reflected in the polished surface of a silver serving piece, the figure of a woman appeared, barely more than an impression, positioned so that she existed simultaneously in the room and outside it, present and observing. The quality of that figure's presence was the part of the painting that stopped conversation at its nearest tables first and spread from there until the room, which had been managing its noise with the comfortable efficiency of people who treat silence as a social failure, went entirely quiet without anyone making the decision to be quiet. It was not the silence of a room in which something has failed. It was the silence of a room in which something has arrived that nobody had planned for. Augustus crossed the floor to the foot of the stage and stood there with hands clasped, watching the last minutes of work with the focused attention of a man who has learned to understand what he is seeing rather than to perform understanding. Rowan completed the canvas with a single gesture, a thin trace of silver applied beneath the uppermost layer of blue, visible only when the light struck at a specific angle, at which point it ran through the full depth of the composition, like the vein it was. Augustus named the technique before anyone asked him to. Silver vein, which had appeared in precisely 7 authenticated R. Vale works and in no other paintings in any documented collection anywhere, a marking so particular in its execution that its presence had long been considered one of the most reliable indicators of genuine authorship. Landon said the technique was documented in academic articles available to anyone who chose to study them, and that a talented painter with years around genuine Vale materials could develop a convincing approximation. Augustus asked Rowan what the painting was called. Rowan looked at the canvas for a moment, then said its name was The Man Outside the Frame. Augustus opened the bidding at $250,000, and before the number had settled a second collector raised it, and then a third, and the figures climbed without ceremony. 500,000, 750,000, 1 million, 1.4 million, 1.8 million, each number accumulating in the atmosphere of a room that had not anticipated being surprised. Landon moved to the center and said no binding transaction should take place around an unverified work. Augustus agreed that verification was appropriate and raised his offer to $2 million conditional on authentication as a genuine Vale piece, a number large enough that no further bid came. Celeste stood at the edge of the stage, understanding that the social exercise she had designed to expose a presumptuous waiter had become the year's most significant art event, and that every calculation she had made when she sent Rowan to the easel had been wrong. When Rowan stepped down, a foundation attorney was waiting. The work had been produced during his contracted hours, using hotel-owned materials, during a foundation event, and its ownership was in dispute pending legal review. Rowan made no claim on the money. He looked at the canvas and asked only that no protective coating be applied before the paint had fully dried, a request that Dr. Camille Arden, standing 3 feet away with an examination lamp, heard as the specific practical knowledge of someone who had lived inside the chemistry of painting rather than merely studied it. She waited until the crowd had shifted before turning her lamp on the base layer at a low oblique angle. Beneath the blue, pressed into the gesso before the paint had been applied, 2 small letters had been worked into the primed fabric, LH. They did not appear in any catalog, any authentication report, or any published material associated with Vale, a marking that no researcher, no imitator, and no study of the existing literature could have produced, because it had never been documented anywhere that it existed. The story that explained the marking reached back 14 years, to a 2-room apartment in Brooklyn, where Rowan Hale made deliveries during daylight hours and painted at the kitchen table after his daughter had gone to sleep, working with the disciplined urgency of someone who understood that the hours available to him were limited in a way that had nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with the arithmetic of a working-class family. Laurel Hale was a photographer who had watched her husband's work develop with the grounded conviction of someone who had seen a great deal of art and knew what she was seeing, and who understood that the system determining what received recognition was not neutral, that it evaluated work through filters of institution and affiliation that had nothing to do with the work itself. She proposed the pseudonym R. Vale as a mechanism to let the paintings reach their audience without the context of who had made them, and she managed the alias with complete control, photographing each stage of every canvas, maintaining a numbering system for every piece, recording Rowan's material formulas, handling all gallery correspondence, and protecting his identity with the seriousness of someone who understood that the value of the secret depended on how completely it was kept. Landon Frost was then running a mid-market gallery in Manhattan and approached the alias with an offer of exclusive representation. The first 3 works sold modestly, and then Augustus Pembroke purchased a painting called The Harbor Before Dawn, and the name R. Vale acquired the gravitational pull that a single serious collector's attention can generate. When Laurel became ill, the intricate structure she had built began to lose the constant attention required to maintain it, and Landon arrived during this period with paperwork he described as an administrative update, a revision to the representation terms, a formality, nothing that would change the practical arrangement. Rowan signed during the worst week of the year, in a stretch when he had not slept a full night in 11 days, without reading it carefully. The document transferred all commercial rights to the pseudonym R. Vale to Landon's company, including authority to license, exhibit, sell, and represent the name in every context. Laurel discovered the substitution before she died. She could not undo it, but she began quietly reproducing what documentation she could, recording her observations in a notebook using a photographic ink formula she had adapted from her technical photography work, one that remained invisible under normal light and would only develop under infrared wavelengths. She did not have time to finish. After she was gone, Rowan went to the gallery and found the studio cleared, his sketches and canvases gone, Landon prepared with the contract and the position that Rowan had signed away any claim he might make. Landon offered continued production in exchange for silence, or litigation for breach of contract if Rowan refused. And Rowan chose neither, walking out and spending the next 12 years raising his daughter, working jobs that paid reliably, and saying nothing about what R. Vale was or what had been taken, because he did not want Nora to carry the belief that she had cost her father something he would have chosen differently. In the 12 years that followed, Landon maintained the R. Vale mythology by controlling scarcity, releasing works slowly, sustaining the fiction of an artist in voluntary hiding, and when the genuine inventory ran low, using Rowan's stolen sketches as foundations for canvases he commissioned from other painters who had not been told whose method they were adapting. Rowan knew the counterfeit works existed, but had no money for legal action and no documentation that would survive a challenge from a man who controlled all the paper. In the present, after Camille had shown him the letters under the lamp and asked their meaning, Rowan said, "Laurel Hale, his wife, who was present beneath every layer of light he had ever laid down." Augustus, standing nearby, understood that Rowan had just disclosed something that no researcher, no imitator, and no student of the existing literature could have known, because its existence had never been recorded anywhere except in the paintings themselves. By the following morning, footage from the gala had spread widely enough that 3 publications were running competing versions of the same story, each arriving at the same questions: whether the hotel waiter was genuinely the artist behind one of the most valuable anonymous bodies of American painting in living memory, who legally owned a painting that had attracted a $2 million bid before the bidding was suspended, and how many R. Vale works in private and institutional collections might not be what their provenance documents claimed. Celeste called an emergency meeting of the Foundation's leadership and the hotel's legal department simultaneously. Landon arrived with the prepared calmness of a man who had spent the previous night constructing a single coherent account. Rowan was an opportunist with professional familiarity with authentic Vale Materials, a former logistics worker who had identified the gala as the single venue most likely to put him in proximity with Augustus Pembroke, who had staged the confrontation with Frost and engineered the stage appearance and produced a painting calculated to exploit the room's emotional response to a compelling story. He reminded the room that the Foundation's Vale holdings represented a combined assessed value approaching $80 million, and that publicly entertaining Rowan's claim would expose every piece in the collection to immediate re-examination, destabilizing the broader market and the credibility of the institutions that had authenticated these works. The legal team recommended a sequence of protective actions: transfer the painting to secure storage, suspend Rowan's employment pending investigation, issue a statement characterizing the gala bidding as a performance element rather than an authenticated commercial transaction, seek an injunction preventing Rowan from publicly claiming authorship while proceedings were ongoing, and if he continued regardless, initiate litigation with enough visible momentum to signal the cost. Celeste approved most of these measures within the hour, because the alternative, entertaining the possibility that her foundation had assembled its flagship collection around fraudulent certifications, was a risk she could not absorb while the Pembroke Museum partnership was still in a phase where either party could withdraw. Rowan received his suspension notice the following morning. Holden Pike provided a written account, suggesting Rowan had sought information about the gala's guest list on at least 2 occasions in the preceding weeks, lending the evening's events a premeditated quality that Celeste's attorneys found useful. Augustus insisted the painting be placed in the custody of a neutral institutional party until authentication was complete, and he transferred $2 million into an escrow account to demonstrate his offer had been genuine. Camille conducted a preliminary materials analysis funded directly by Augustus, structured so that results were shared simultaneously with all parties. Her 3-day analysis produced results that were significant without being conclusive. The binding compound in the silver layer was chemically consistent with the 7 authenticated early Vale works and inconsistent with the Foundation's more recently acquired pieces. The palette knife Rowan used was a model discontinued 13 years earlier. The layering sequence matched the authenticated works with a precision difficult to achieve by accident but insufficient to establish legal authorship on its own. Landon then produced the contract, bearing Rowan's genuine signature, witnessed and dated in a period consistent with Landon's account, and Rowan confirmed the signature was his, placed on a document he had been told was something else during a week when he had not been capable of reading anything carefully. Celeste said the contract settled the matter. Camille examined the paper stock of the signature page under magnification and ultraviolet light and identified a manufacturing watermark corresponding to a production run that had not been distributed until several months after the date printed on the contract, meaning the page bearing Rowan's signature had almost certainly been inserted into a document that had not existed when he signed it. Before Camille could complete a full analysis of the paper sample, the examination facility was entered after hours by someone who took nothing of monetary value and removed only the paper sample. the single piece of physical evidence that would have confirmed the forgery. A business card from Landon Frost was left in the center of the examination table. Celeste authorized Camille to conduct a private examination of 3 selected Vale works from the Foundation's collection. Authorization given verbally, without written record, in the way that decisions are sometimes made by people who are not yet sure which version of themselves they are going to become. Landon protested that removing paintings from their frames risked structural damage and valuation loss, and Celeste overruled him without full explanation, which was a change in her behavior that he noticed, and which altered his calculation of how much time he had. The results arrived in stages, and each made the previous one more serious. The first painting examined had been made by Rowan. The silver compound, the layering sequence, the 3 horizon fractures, the embedded marking, and the pigment formulation all corresponded to his documented method with precision that no imitation had matched. The second work had been stretched on a canvas support manufactured after the date by which Vale was supposed to have ceased all production, making it physically impossible for the painting to have been created in the period the provenance documents claimed. Winter Without Footprints contained a synthetic pigment compound only commercially available for 6 years, and the LH marking had been placed in the lower right rather than the lower left, in the manner of someone who had heard about the marking's existence without having seen where it actually appeared. The X-ray imaging produced the most significant finding. Beneath the painted surface of the false work was a drawing that had been used as the compositional foundation before the oil layers were built over it. A quick, confident sketch of a woman's face rendered in the shorthand of someone working from direct observation and long familiarity simultaneously, with a quality of attention that belonged to a different order of engagement than the landscape painted over it. Rowan identified the drawing without needing to be asked. It was a preparatory study for a portrait of Laurel that he had begun during her illness and never completed, a drawing that had been in his Brooklyn studio when he left it for the last time, never photographed, never shared. The only way that drawing could exist beneath a painting in the Whitlock Foundation's collection was if Landon had direct access to materials removed from Rowan's studio after Rowan had left. Celeste sat with this information for several hours before Landon came to her office with a settlement proposal. His company would pay Rowan $5 million in exchange for a signed declaration stating that Rowan had served as a technical assistant in Vale's production rather than as the primary artist. The pseudonym would remain under Landon's control, all authentication activity would cease, and a confidentiality agreement with significant penalties would be signed by all parties. Rowan declined within the hour. He told Camille directly that there was no price for this particular thing. What he wanted was not compensation for himself, but acknowledgement for Laurel. That she had existed, that she had built the system that made the work possible, that her name belonged in the record of everything that bore Vale's. Landon responded through his attorney with a detailed account of the litigation Rowan could expect, its cost, its duration, and the probability that a prolonged public dispute between a celebrated foundation director and a suspended hotel waiter would be shaped more by the power differential than by the facts. Augustus disclosed, that same afternoon, that a letter from Laurel had arrived at his office in the weeks before her death, a letter referencing documentation she planned to secure, and that it had arrived already opened, with its most significant page absent. The articles appeared 2 days after the gala, published across outlets with varying credibility, but the same underlying sourcing. They described Rowan as a former gallery logistics worker who had used years of proximity to authentic Vale materials to develop a technically sophisticated imitation of the artist's method, noted his unemployment before the hotel job, his accumulated debts, the pressure of raising a daughter alone, and framed these facts as the context of a man with motive. One piece published a photograph taken 12 years earlier, showing Rowan moving wrapped canvases through a loading dock, identifying him in the caption as a studio assistant, a word that transformed documented physical labor into evidence of subordinate creative standing. Another quoted Holden Pike describing Rowan as someone who had asked targeted questions about the gala's guest list in the preceding weeks, reframing the entire evening as a premeditated approach, rather than a spontaneous confrontation about a false painting. The $2 million escrow was frozen pending resolution of the ownership dispute, and several major gallery owners issued a collective statement calling for patience and procedural adherence, which in practical terms meant a suspension of any public acknowledgement of Rowan's possible identity. Nora arrived at Rowan's apartment after reading 3 of the pieces, carrying under her arm a wooden box with a simple latch, one that Laurel had left behind, and that Rowan had moved from place to place for 20 years without opening, because he had made himself a promise not to, because he had believed the contents would make the loss worse rather than better. She put it on the table and told him he could not afford to protect himself from the past any longer. Inside the box, a medium-format camera that had been Laurel's primary documentation instrument, several rolls of undeveloped film, a notebook with blank-appearing pages that showed no visible ink under the kitchen light, a small key with a number engraved into its metal, and a single photograph of Laurel standing in the Brooklyn studio beside a large canvas, her left hand resting on the frame's upper edge, her face carrying the expression she wore when she believed something was already finished even if the work was not. Rowan looked at the photograph for a long time. He was disappointed by what was not in the box. The contract documentation he had hoped Laurel had managed to preserve, the explicit legal evidence that would settle the question without further investigation. He told Camille the box held nothing useful. Camille picked up the notebook and carried it to a window, recognized that certain inks used in technical photography work remain invisible under standard light but respond to infrared wavelengths, and brought the notebook to her examination equipment. What appeared across those pages was Laurel's complete record. Each work listed with its pigment formula, its date of completion, the reference number written on the back of the canvas before painting began, the specific occasions when Landon had presented papers for signing and described them inaccurately. Each misrepresentation recorded with the care of someone building a case rather than keeping a diary, and, at the end of the visible record, a single note. If Rowan needed to prove who he was, he should begin with the painting that Augustus was already holding. Augustus consented to a full examination of the harbor before dawn. At the edges of the canvas where the fabric wrapped around the stretcher bars, Camille found partial fingerprints pressed into the primed fabric before the first paint layer had been applied. Both Rowan's and Laurel's, confirmed by analysis. An X-ray of the painting's sky revealed a sequence of marks worked into the grain of the paint, referencing a storage number that matched the key in the wooden box. When Rowan, Camille, and Augustus arrived at the bank facility corresponding to the key, the storage door had been opened recently enough that the locking mechanism had not fully reset. The interior was empty, and on the shelf where Laurel's documents had been stored, a single business card had been placed at the center with the precision of someone making a point, rather than leaving a trace by accident. Landon announced the exhibition 4 days later under the title The Final Works of R. Vale. 6 paintings never before publicly displayed, presented alongside the revelation of the artist's true identity. He had identified a man named Adrian Bell to stand as the face of this disclosure, a retired painter in his mid-70s, who had worked in Landon's orbit for decades, and who was managing serious medical expenses with limited resources, circumstances that made a structured payment arrangement difficult to decline. Adrian had been prepared with a biographical account of decades spent in productive seclusion, emerging only now to accept credit for work the world had long admired, and the 6 paintings he would present had been produced by at least 3 different painters working from Rowan's stolen sketches and adapted to approximate the early R. Vale style as closely as extended study and professional skill could bring them. Rowan's instinct was to appear publicly before the exhibition and challenge the entire construction. Camille told him directly that this would cost him the outcome he was trying to achieve. Without the vault documents, without the destroyed paper sample, the available evidence was strong enough to raise serious doubt, but not yet strong enough to overpower a notarized contract and a man prepared to stand in public and accept a famous name. And if Rowan disrupted the exhibition, without the means to resolve the central question in that moment, Landon would use the disruption as the story. The aggrieved former assistant who had convinced himself of something the documents did not support. Augustus proposed a different approach. He would attend the exhibition as a prospective buyer, a role that gave him the greatest natural authority in the room, and at an appropriate moment, he would request that the provenance documentation for the 6 new works be reviewed before witnesses, standard practice for first offerings of this scale, and that Adrian perform a technical demonstration confirming his familiarity with the materials. Rowan would be present as a hotel staff member. Celeste, after a private conversation with Augustus, in which the full extent of her own vulnerability had been laid out plainly, agreed to allow the plan to proceed on the condition that no collector who came in good faith be exposed to financial harm. The exhibition opened on a Thursday evening to a full audience. Adrian delivered the prepared biography with the polished ease of someone who had performed smaller versions of this kind of introduction throughout his professional life, and Landon positioned himself alongside with the demeanor of a man whose patience had finally been publicly rewarded. Rowan stood at the back of the room in his staff uniform, occupying the position he had always occupied at events like this one, outside the central frame, attending to what the room needed without being part of what the room believed it was doing. Landon noticed him and acknowledged him to the crowd as the waiter who had made headlines at the gala, framing the presence as confirmation that the genuine article and the imitation were now visible in the same room. Camille asked whether Adrian might be willing to reconstruct a small technical element from the harbor before dawn, specifically the mixing sequence for the gray tone used in the painting's water reflection, a color that had no published formula and had been developed through years of Rowan's own experimentation. Adrian attempted it with the attention of someone who had prepared for a broad range of questions and had not prepared for this specific one. What he produced was technically accomplished and compositionally wrong. The gray sat in the wrong temperature register, missing the warmth the original achieved through a counterintuitive admixture that had no textbook basis. Rowan was asked to attempt the same exercise, and the color he produced matched the original, within a margin the room could see without instrumentation. Then Augustus asked Landon to display the provenance documents for the 6 new works. The certificates bore Laurel's signature. Rowan saw them from across the room and knew they were false before he could articulate why. Laurel had signed every art document she ever produced with her first name, last name, and middle initial, without exception, and these signatures contained none, because whoever had forged them had known her name but not her habit. Then Adrian Bell turned toward the microphone and said, without any preparation that anyone had anticipated, that he had been told he would only need to do this once, and that the man who had made him that promise had not mentioned that the real artist would be standing in the room while he did it. Adrian's account of the arrangement was brief and specific. He described a payment schedule tied to the exhibition's proceeds, a biography he had been given rather than written, and a legal agreement he had signed under the pressure of a medical situation that made the terms feel less important than the relief they offered. He said he had told himself the harm was small enough to absorb until the moment Rowan walked through the door, and that seeing Rowan standing at the back in a staff uniform, occupying the position of someone who had been systematically excluded from the space his own work had created, made the rationalization impossible to sustain. He provided the address of a warehouse in Brooklyn where Landon had maintained a secured storage operation for years. Landon moved toward the building's service exit before Adrian had finished. Celeste was positioned in the private access corridor and gave the instruction that revoked his keycard authorization and signaled the security team simultaneously. She had placed a call to the State Attorney General's Art Fraud Division 40 minutes before the exhibition began, and the investigator who answered that call was already present in the building when Adrian spoke. Landon was detained without physical confrontation, without urgency, without drama, with only the quiet efficiency of a process that had been put in motion before he realized the evening was not moving in the direction he had prepared for. He was escorted from the room past the collectors and museum representatives who had come expecting a historic disclosure and had received, instead, a different and more complete one. The warehouse held the full record. Rowan's original sketches were there, organized in Laurel's numbering system. Unfinished canvases bore the marks of Rowan's process, and the incompleteness of work interrupted rather than abandoned. A complete copy of the modified contract existed, not the paper sample Landon had had destroyed, but a full duplicate set that Camille had sent to a separate laboratory before the first was eliminated, without telling anyone she had done so. Financial records documented payments to the 3 painters who had produced counterfeit R. Vale work without being told whose method they were adapting. And among the folders was Laurel's complete letter to Augustus, with the missing page restored, describing in specific terms the documentation she had prepared, where she had placed it, and what she had understood about what Landon had done. Camille presented the findings over several hours to an audience that now included collectors, journalists, museum representatives, and members of the Attorney General's staff, in the same ballroom where Rowan had held a brush 12 days earlier. 7 authenticated early R. Vale works had been produced by a single hand, and that hand was Rowan's. The material evidence, the technical analysis, the fingerprint record, the photographic documentation from Laurel's developed film, and the embedded markings aligned without exception across every piece, the works produced under R. Vale's name after the original artist's disappearance had been made by at least 3 different people. The contract that had given Landon commercial control of the pseudonym had been assembled from 2 separate documents, with the rights transfer section printed on paper stock that postdated Rowan's genuine signature by several months. Every provenance certificate bearing Laurel's name had been forged by someone who had known her signature but not her signing habits. The man outside the frame was the first authentic Vale work produced in 12 years. Celeste came to the stage without prepared remarks. She said she had elevated Landon's authority because it had served her to have it unexamined, that this was a failure different in type from deliberate fraud but not unrelated to it in effect, and that she was prepared to spend significant resources addressing what that failure had enabled. The Foundation would fund independent authentication review of every Vale work it had sold or brokered. Buyers of fraudulent works would receive full restitution. All confirmed authentic works would be documented with Rowan Hale as artist of record, with Laurel Hale acknowledged in all provenance materials as co-documentarian and creative partner. A legal support fund would be established for artists who had experienced similar appropriation of their work by former representatives. Holden Pike was suspended for providing a false account of Rowan's conduct at the gala. The painting was returned to the stage, and Augustus confirmed $2 million at the price of his original offer, declining a competing bid from a collector who had entered the room after the presentation. Rowan paused the bidding and agreed to sell at $2 million with 3 conditions. The painting would be publicly displayed for at least 6 months of every calendar year. Laurel's name would appear in all documentation associated with the work, and a portion of the sale proceeds would establish a scholarship for artists who had interrupted their practice to care for family. Augustus agreed to each condition without modification. Before being escorted from the building, Landon said that without his management, Rowan would have remained exactly where he had found him. Rowan answered that selling what someone else creates is not the same as understanding what creation is. After the room's applause had settled, Rowan stood near the easel and looked at the brush he had set down. He had recovered a name that night, but he did not yet know whether he had recovered the desire. 6 months of investigation produced the documentation that legal processes accumulate when the underlying fraud is extensive. Testimony from the 3 painters who had produced counterfeit work without understanding whose method they were imitating, records of wire transfers and invoice falsification across 11 years, a certified accounting of more than $30 million in proceeds from works not made by their attributed creator. Restitution proceedings moved with the deliberateness of all such proceedings, and collectors who had purchased fraudulent works through Foundation channels received the compensation Celeste had committed to without challenge. 2 of the 3 painters who had produced work under Landon's direction came forward publicly, were cleared of wrongdoing, and were compensated for labor used without full disclosure of its purpose. Rowan used his portion of the sale proceeds in the sequence that felt correct. The debts accumulated over 12 years of single parenthood, and the medical costs that had outlasted Laurel by a decade were settled first. Nora's remaining tuition was secured. A lease was signed on a studio in Brooklyn with north-facing windows and enough floor space to keep multiple canvases in progress simultaneously. The Laurel Hale Fund was established, directed toward 2 purposes: supporting artists who had paused their practice to manage family obligations, and providing free authentication assistance to artists disputing authorship of their work, accepting applications without institutional affiliation requirements, because the requirement it was built around was simpler than that. Celeste retained her position as CEO, but removed herself from direct authority over acquisition decisions, transferring that function to an independent advisory board she had no hand in selecting and no vote in. She invited Rowan to mount an exhibition in a Whitlock venue. He declined the ballroom and the formal gallery spaces and chose instead the employee dining room on the building's lower level. A plain and functional space, the hotel converted to a clean exhibition room with white walls and open admission, no ticket required, no reservation needed, accessible to anyone who walked through the door. The painting at the center of that exhibition was not the man outside the frame, which was in Philadelphia on the first of its annual public showings. It was the portrait of Laurel, the study found beneath the false canvas, completed at last by the only person who had ever intended to finish it, showing her as she had looked one morning in their Brooklyn apartment, standing near the window with the camera on her shoulder and the particular expression she wore when she was already composing the frame before she raised the viewfinder. Nora stood in front of it for a long time at the opening and said she had never known until that moment that her father's painting had always been a way of continuing to see. She told Rowan she had never needed him to give up anything to prove that he loved her. He heard this fully and understood that returning to the work was not a betrayal of the years that had kept him from it. It was the only form the years could take that honored both what had been lost and what had been kept. A year after the gala, Rowan crossed the Whitlock Grand's lobby on his way out and saw a young server nearby drop a tray close to a group of guests and be immediately addressed by the floor manager in a tone designed to correct publicly rather than privately. He stopped, crouched, and helped the server collect the scattered pieces one by one. The manager recognized him and shifted into the register of address that recognition sometimes produces. Mr. Hale, with the adjustment in posture that accompanies a title when the title has not always been offered. Rowan straightened and said he had stood in exactly the place the server was standing, and that the server deserved to be spoken to with the respect the work required. On the wall behind them, on loan from Augustus Pembroke, the man outside the frame caught the light from the corridor windows at the angle Rowan had understood when he first laid down the silver. The label beneath it read, Rowan Hale, formerly known as R. Vale, dedicated to Laurel Hale, who always saw the man standing outside the frame. He did not stop to look at the painting or consider its value. He walked on toward the studio, where a canvas was waiting, white and unbegun, patient for the first stroke.